Thank you very much. My name is Ahmad Harb. I am the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I was reminded by my colleague to nicely ask for you to silence your phones. Possible they ring and they make a little noise. Thank you very much for joining us for this final panel of today's conference. This is our 8th annual conference for those of you who are counting. It's titled Democracy in Crisis, Geopolitical Shifts and U.S. Challenges in the Middle East. Today's panel, or our panel today, will look at the United States and democracy in U.S. foreign policy, impact, legacy, and the implications of the 2024 elections. As we all know, the United States is very, very interested in what goes on in the Middle East. The Middle East is also very interested in what goes on in the United States. U.S. Domestic politics is also influences U.S. foreign policy, and the Middle East region is very, very interested in how things develop, especially these days. Everybody is wondering what the new elections next year, presidential and definitely congressional, what kind of administration they bring in, how will that impact United States foreign policy towards the Middle East, obviously. And there is a lot of discussion there about what might or might not happen in those elections and what the following period will bring. Today, as we start this session, I'd like to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. Patricia Karam is a Senior Policy Advisor on Iran at Freedom House, and she's a non-resident fellow with Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Kyle Kondik is a Managing Editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Shibley Telhami is Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and Dr. Shibley will be joining us virtually. And Tess McEnery, Executive Director at the Project on Middle East Democracy, POMED. Every colleague will have about 12 to 15 minutes. We have some time to present their presentations, after which we will do some question and answer period from the audience and from the virtual audience. For the audience in the room, please submit your questions on the cards provided to you, and we will get to as many questions as possible. For the people online, please submit your answers on the Zoom link on your page or by email at events@arabcenterdc.org. Thank you very much. And Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmad. And thank you, Arab Center, for having me today. I will start by saying that when we talk today about the trials and tribulations of U.S. democracy promotion and policy priorities, there's nothing more jarring than the image of President Donald Trump repeatedly hosting Egyptian strongman President Abdel Fattah Sisi in Washington, without, of course, mentioning the regime's abysmal human rights record, which ultimately spoke volumes about the administration's priorities at the time. This was, of course, reinforced by its unwavering support of Saudi Arabia, even after it became known that Mohammed bin Salman had ordered the execution of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. That same Saudi Arabia that had interfered nefariously to roll back democratic gains in places like Bahrain, Egypt, or even Tunisia. We all remember that. But then again, the previous administration of President Obama hadn't either imposed serious cost on Sisi's regime for its oppression, for its repression, or on the Saudi monarchy for its anti-democratic meddling. And neither has President Biden, for that matter. By the end of President Obama's presidency, He had largely retreated from full support of the Arab Spring and democracy promotion to remaining silent when the Egyptian military staged a coup against democratically elected President Morsi, then diverted his attention to other foreign policy priorities, the so-called pivot to Asia. And we've been on this trajectory since, despite affirmations to the contrary. Meanwhile, the US may not be embroiled on a daily basis in conflicts, in active conflicts in the region, but strife is still underway in Syria and Libya in particular. Outside of the Gulf in the region, every country is facing some level of political or economic crisis. We have overly centralized public sector dominated economies that have really not created jobs for an ever-growing population of youth that is entering the workforce. Youth unemployment continues to be double the world's average. For certain, the euphoria of the Arab Spring protests, all of which have failed, quickly turned to dysphoria with really the entrenchment of authoritarianism, terrorism, and civil strife. All that to say that democratic space is shrinking, together with this added perception that democracy is not delivering on peace and prosperity. And here, Tunisia is a case in point, as are, one could argue, the dysfunctional democracies of Iraq and Lebanon. Now, US foreign policy has been afflicted by the tension between realism and idealism. During the Bush era, if you recall, neoconservatives made democracy building a driving force of foreign policy. The idea was that if the Middle East was shaped in the US's image, the problems the US confronted in the Middle East, namely Islamism, terrorism, and the like, would disappear, and which then translated into a series of policy initiatives to promote democracy. Few saw it in the region as sincere and believed that ulterior motives would prevail. This was the skepticism in reaction. And then the other reaction was resentment for its interference. And of course, the Bush administration efforts were thereafter derailed by the disastrous effects of the Iraq War. Today, Russia and China have tremendously increased its influence in the region. And this is underpinned by a competition for influence between a regional competition for influence between Iran, Turkey, Israel, and other Arab actors. And after the Ukraine invasion, these trends have also amplified narratives that really push back against universal norms and values, and in turn have negatively affected the US's image. You basically have Russia and China competing with the US for economic, diplomatic, and military clout, and building up to an ideological confrontation over democracy and human rights by really presenting an autocratic alternative in a region where autocracy is rampant. And this opposition to the democratic values is also really resonating with with efforts by local leaders to really preempt calls for democratization. And of course, China's paternalistic model in particular is resonating with these states which are competing for China's attention. So, and while the promotion of democracy and human rights may have been more or less part of the US foreign policy for decades, and the US has spent billions of dollars a year on it across dozens of government agencies to really advance democracy and human rights, and maybe this is something that Tess will talk about, one may ask if they were ultimately effective, especially considering the fiascos of the war in Iraq and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which really dealt a serious blow to the US's image and credibility. People throughout the region, and indeed around the world, thought, if this is democracy promotion, then please save me from it. So allies are really losing faith in American leadership, while illiberal regimes are growing in number, stature, and audacity. Does this mean that democracy promotion has been oversold, or that the US cannot or should not advance the cause of liberty abroad? There is no doubt that when President Biden draws the line between democracies and autocracies, this really sends encouragement to people behind today's Iron Curtains, even if some regard it as righteous. So words matter, but they matter less without action. And while the United States can do little directly from the outside until there is a critical mass of citizens that is prepared to confront an autocratic regime, US actions can really help form that critical mass over time. Case in point are those acts of self-assertion that we have seen emerge against oppression in citizen movements in 2019 and 2020 in Algeria, in Iraq and Lebanon, and then in 2020 against the brutal mistreatment of women in Iraq. These actions remind us that no matter how intractable the region's issues and conflicts seem, people who don't have democracy or fear losing one will take astonishing risks in the name of dignity and freedom, or even the accountability that democracies offer. So critical moments for US democracy promotion really occur when there are protests against an authoritarian regime, but they may also be triggered by a multitude of events, like a coup in which a military overthrows a democratically elected leader, the refusal of an authoritarian leader to step down, the launch of negotiations to stop power, to transfer power, when an election pits democratic against autocratic forces, or when a crisis occurs that can undermine a democratic transition or a reversal to authoritarianism or cause a reversal. Then there is an opportunity to advance democracy. The reality, of course, is that the US efforts to promote democracy sometimes collide with the need to work with authoritarian and reluctant allies and partners in an era of great power competition. One way of promoting democracy is by making the US a model of what democracy can do for people, and really by clearly distinguishing which democratic nations it will give material and diplomatic support to and which autocracies it will work with as a matter of national interest. In some ways, this has been Biden's own guiding principle, though his decision to fold Saudi Arabia, to Saudi Arabia in the hope of increasing oil production at the time shows how hard it is to toe this line in practice. So in my view, and I will conclude, the US really needs to adopt a new strategy that seeks to create a new network of allies who represent civil society and advocate for freedoms, representation, and good governance. The future of US national security and a more democratic world, which is certainly not assured with the overall kind of dip in global freedoms, depends really on emboldening democratic allies against the rise of authoritarianism and really growing the community of democratic nations. One way, of course, of doing this is to really expand the deployment of low-profile, ground-level democracy programs for civil society. Supporting democratization abroad is not only about high-level diplomacy, vocal statements, naming and shaming, targeted sanctions, or calling for elections, but really providing support for freedom fighters, civil society, which can be the entire range of organized groups and institutions that are really independent of the state and are vital in supporting democratic transitions, preventing backsliding, and keeping it once it is achieved. What is certain, though, what is certain, therefore, is that the US needs to adopt bolder new policies to regain the advantage in the great power competition and help vulnerable democracies and democrats, including its own, resist authoritarian influence and strengthen the shrinking democratic community in the MENA region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Pat?
I'm going to talk a little bit about our upcoming presidential campaign, or rather ongoing presidential campaign, which arguably our presidential campaigns, I mean, they have endings, but then they just start right up again because of the way our electoral calendar is and the fact that everyone's always campaigning. But, you know, when I was in 5th grade, I had a history teacher who, you know, as middle schoolers are, they ask a lot of annoying questions. And sometimes he would get frustrated with all these like what if questions, and he would respond and say, you know, what if the world hung by a string and the string broke? Like, you know, it's like, well, I don't know what would happen. But, you know, I sort of think about this campaign as like the sort of like what if campaign, like what if Joe Biden's health is such that he decides he can't run again? What if Donald Trump's legal problems cause him to get out of the race? What if there's a late entering candidate? What if there are significant third-party challengers? On and on and on. And yet, I think all of those sort of questions kind of obscures the fact that this is actually a very undramatic nominating season, perhaps the least dramatic we've had since, this is a little bit before my time, but the 2000 election, when Al Gore, as the sitting vice president, was sort of the very likely Democratic nominee, and George W. Bush at that time, who was the Texas governor, was the very likely Republican nominee. There were some twists and turns in that race, particularly on the Republican side, but ultimately Gore and Bush were pretty easily nominated. And here we have this situation with both Biden and Trump, where both of them have weaknesses. You could ask people, hey, do you think Biden or Trump should run again? Majorities of the public say no, that they should not run again. And yet they're both pretty big favorites to be nominated by their respective parties. And so I think we have to sort of think about all of these contingencies, these what if questions, even though the matchup for next year seems fairly clear for this point in the nominating cycle. It would be natural to compare the 2024 race to 2020, given that if it is in fact Biden versus Trump, it would be a rematch. But I actually think the better comparison is probably 2016, in the sense that both Trump and Biden are probably going to have worse favorability / approval numbers than they did in 2020. And that would make it sort of akin to 2016, where you had two very unpopular major party nominees in both Trump and Hillary Clinton. So just to sort of put that in some perspective, I was looking at the average favorability numbers for Trump and Clinton in 2016 and where Biden and Trump are now. So on the eve of the election in 2016, Trump was about 40% favorable, 58% unfavorable. Clinton was a little bit better in 42% favorable, 55% unfavorable. Those are still pretty bad numbers for both of them. You look at the numbers for both Biden and Trump right now. Biden's approval, 41%, 55% on average disapproval. Trump's favorability, 40%, unfavorability, 56%. And what does that tell you? Well, just like in 2016, you're going to have a sizable block of the electorate, if in fact it's Biden versus Trump, that holds a negative view of both candidates. And those are the people who are probably going to decide who ends up winning the election. And what we know from some polling and also from some of the results, particularly in 2022, or at least suggestions for the 2022 results, is that some of these voters who are in the middle, who maybe think of themselves as independents, first of all, the thing about American politics is that people who call themselves independents many of them have sort of a hidden party label one way or the other, but also they tend to pay the least amount of attention to the actual campaign. So it's like the people who are most persuadable and are most important in the campaign actually pay the least amount of attention to politics. And these are folks who really, again, don't have strong positive views and really have negative views of both major party candidates. But they also, what we know from some polling research, they maybe sort of tend to be a little bit more conservative in their outlook, which is good for the Republicans. But also they really don't like Trump, and they really don't like what happened on January 6, 2021, and some of Trump's just sort of abnormal behavior, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the White House. And so there is some thought, at least I feel this way, that at the end of the day, those voters are probably a little bit more gettable for Biden, and maybe that makes him a tiny little bit of a favorite in a potential rematch. But there are a whole lot of uncertainties, including the presence of third-party candidates, and also what turnout is going to look like. Despite all of Donald Trump's problems and the criticisms of him, one thing that he did do was that he basically, I think, supercharged participation in elections, in that our turnout, particularly in 2020, was historically high. Also, the turnout in the two recent midterms, 2018 and 2022, were also fairly high for our midterms. And so a lot of people may not like Trump, or they really do like him, but it just I think his presence has sort of motivated people to come out either for him or against him. But I'm curious to see if basically this sort of rematch that we may have the effect of basically depressing some turnout a little bit, because people will just be, those people who don't like both of their choices, maybe they just decide to opt out of the election. Obviously in the United States, we have this kind of strange system of electing a president where it's a state by state election. And we have the electoral college to determine things. Obviously, sometimes the person who gets the most votes doesn't always win. And also in this era we're in a highly competitive era of American presidential elections. There hasn't been a double-digit margin in the national popular vote since 1984 when Ronald Reagan got reelected. So that was almost 40 years ago. But at the same time, the number of states that vote similarly to the nation have declined over the course of the last several decades, so that most of the states are pretty uncompetitive at the presidential level. Only 7 states were decided by less than 3 points in the most recent election: Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and the industrial North, which basically decided the election in 2016, and then also Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Georgia in the Sun Belt. That's it. 7 of the 50 states decided by less than 3 points. Those are the places where I think we're probably going to end up focusing the campaign here in 2024. But it is this sort of strange dynamic in which you have these consistently competitive presidential elections, but so many voters they're not disenfranchised in a technical way, but they are sort of disenfranchised in a practical kind of way, given that they live in states where the outcome of the election is not really that much in doubt. And so that's what I've always thought is sort of, I'm definitely more of a American elections person than someone who focuses on what's going on in other countries or sort of international matters. But it is interesting to me that as this participatory democracy that's basically gotten more democratic over the course of our history and allowed more and more people, be it younger people or minorities or women, to participate in the political process over the course of our history. You still have this system that is kind of very much the slapdash system that is kind of mass participatory democracy grafted onto this sort of ancient electoral college system that, when it was conceived, was not really designed for a time of mass participatory democracy. And so, I always thought, just as the United States presents itself to the world, our own election mechanics are so screwy and so strange and so antiquated. I just always thought that was just kind of odd about our system. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to change. First of all, there's no real mechanism for actually conducting a national federal election. The federal government doesn't actually conduct elections in the U.S. It's a state, or really kind of like a county or local level sort of thing. So that the presidential election is a national election, but it's conducted at the state level. And of course, the Electoral College is written into the Constitution. There was some movement to try to change the Electoral College about half a century ago, after Richard Nixon's victory in 1968, which was also kind of a strange election in that you had Nixon as the Republican candidate, Hubert Humphrey as the Democratic candidate, and then you had George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who was running as a basically kind of conservative segregationist Democrat. Wallace is the last third-party candidate to actually win any states in the Electoral College. Even though Ross Perot got almost 20% of the vote in 1992, he didn't win any states, so he didn't win any electoral votes. But there actually was a movement at that time, and Nixon supported it, to do away with the Electoral College in the aftermath of that election. And there was actually a vote on it in the House, but it died in the Senate. Of course, it would have had to have been ratified by the states as well. And there's just no appetite for doing that right now. So again, very competitive era. I think there's every reason to expect another highly competitive election next year, whether it's Biden versus Trump or whether something upsets that and there are different candidates. But then you still have all of these sort of strange kind of structural pieces of how we elect our presidents, in which it's highly competitive, but a lot of people are, or some votes basically matter more than others based on what states they're in. So that's just sort of the outlook for next year.
Well, thank you, Kyle. Appreciate it. Really interesting how the discussion about the Electoral College is probably the most interesting, because if the United States is a democracy, I mean, who decides who leads the country? The Electoral College or the president who's elected by popular vote? Anyway, Dr. Shibley, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for including me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person with you. So let me just make a few key points, and I hope we'll have a chance to expand during our conversation. I think when I look at the Biden administration's performance so far, the most surprising thing to me is the gap between Democratic expectations of Biden and what he actually did in the Middle East. I think that gap is really remarkable, not only in terms of the expectations of his Democratic constituency, but I would say even Democrats in Congress, that he has not performed as his constituency had expected him to perform, at least towards the Middle East. And I'll elaborate in a minute. And I do think that this certainly will not hurt him a great deal when he faces Donald Trump, because the overwhelming majority of Democrats are going to vote for him no matter what he does on the Middle East if the opponent is Trump. But I do think it affected his standing, and there is evidence it has affected his standing, beginning with the spring of 2021, summer of 2021, when his popularity started dropping. Most of that drop actually happened among Democrats. And so Democrats have been puzzled. And I say puzzled because it isn't that they expected the administration to do something dramatic in the Middle East region. But a lot of the things that Trump did were in the Middle East region. And the Democratic constituency attacked Trump what he did, both his transactionalism, his de-emphasis of human rights, his de-emphasis of international law, his one-sided approach to Israel-Palestine. And there was a lot of critique and expectation that much of that would be reversed, that the administration, the Biden administration, would set a different tone altogether, not only in aggressively reversing Trump's moves, but actually making a stand on the importance of at least international law, but certainly human rights. And I think one of the things that even reinforced that a year later when Russia invaded Ukraine is that the Biden administration very deliberately, in prioritizing that issue, that important issue, and making it in a way center stage of its foreign policy, also simultaneously emphasized a liberal international order, that it was going to make a central theme of its foreign policy, and therefore leading to additional expectation that some of the issues that come out of that would also expand to its policy in the Middle East, and none of that has happened. Obviously, there were some things that the administration itself had promised that were not fulfilled. On the issue of Iran, the administration was still, promised a quick return to the Iran nuclear deal. It hasn't happened. Now, to be fair, it obviously isn't just up to the United States. Iran has something to do with it. But one can argue that they had a better opportunity early on if they had wanted to do that, to accomplish that, and now they find themselves in a much more difficult position to do so. They were going to set a different stage about the priorities in the Gulf, particularly with emphasizing the Yemen war, which Democratic constituents as well as members of Congress emphasized. They paid some attention to that, but certainly not the kind of attention that was expected by the Democratic constituents. Certainly the spread of democracy, for example, the reaction to what happened in Tunisia, we haven't seen a major action in that regard. And on Israel-Palestine, obviously, while they have reversed some of the things that Trump did, a good thing, including renewal of aid to Anwar, various steps that did improve lives on the ground, they have done not much to even restate the commitment of the United States to international law, and not much criticism, even less criticism than any other previous Democratic administration when there were violations of international law. And certainly they have not, as the president had promised before, reopened the consulate in Jerusalem, which is something that the president had said he would do. When you look at that record, you could argue that none of us, those of us who study American foreign policy, who played a role in various stages of American foreign policy, really didn't expect a major breakthrough from Biden, certainly not on Israel-Palestine, or for that matter, a huge, complete revolutionary shift in the Middle East. One understands the strategic interest in the political constraints, but more importantly, the fact that the Middle East, at least certainly not the Israel-Palestine issue, was not the central issue given all of the other priorities the U.S. were facing, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether it was the pandemic, the economy, or the threat to our democracy, the real issues, the racial issues that we had to contend with. Everybody understands that. No one expected that this would be something that the United States, the Biden administration, would spend an enormous amount of time on. And yet they did spend a lot of time on it. It's not like they ignored it, but they spent that energy and made a priority things that were not the expected things. For example, when the issue of settlements came up at the UN, it isn't like the US sat back and let the conversation happen. The US worked overtime, diplomats worked overtime to make sure that there's no punishment for settlement, that this would not come up at the UN. So the US went overtime working for it. When the issue of possible relationship developing between Israel and Saudi Arabia a year ago, the president himself went all the way to Saudi Arabia, a controversial visit that was supposed to Saudi Arabia and Israel, that initially the president said it was done to advance Israeli interests. At the very same time, that the Democratic constituency and Republicans and public opinion generally did not approve of that, and did not approve. They approved of it even less when it was said to be done for Israel or it was said to be done for oil. The public did not approve of that, and yet the president made it a priority. He went all the way out there and paid a price, political price, for not getting much in return. And now, obviously, they're making it a priority again at a time when you have the most right-wing Israeli government in Israeli history. And so, according to the president himself, by the way, so he makes that point, and yet that's what he's doing. So I think that there is a lot of evidence the Democratic public isn't particularly pleased with many of these things, and yet the president seems to be operating at two levels here. One is perhaps his sense of what democratic politics are, based on the time when he served in the Senate, which was very different ballgame. We know that there's been a transformation in public opinion on this issue, certainly among Democrats over the past decade and a half. We see it by all polls, the Pew poll, the Gallup poll, the most recent of the AP poll, and certainly the polls that we have been doing throughout these years, all confirming a trend that is far more critical of American policy on Israel-Palestine, wanting the U.S. to be far more even-handed on this issue than it has been. So the president himself seemed to be, in a way, singularly, based on obviously some of the leaks about what he said to his aides when there's a crisis, about showering Netanyahu with love, when there is a crisis, even at a time when his colleagues, Democratic colleagues in Congress, are asking for him to be more critical. So there is something here related to that gap, but more strategically, I think the interesting thing in the political kind of outlook is that the Middle East, of course, isn't a top priority for the American public, period, and including the Democratic public, and that's understandable. So the time when it really matters for American politics is during primaries, Democratic primaries in particular, where you do have contention issues, including on the Middle East, and particularly as an example of a broader policy. If you're pushing for a liberal international order, pushing for democracy, pushing for rule of law, pushing for a value system that contrasts with Trumpism, then it becomes part and parcel of that advocacy of that value system that Democrats cherish and advocate. But that would only come up in in primaries. We've seen, for example, in congressional politics, that's where the game is. That's when the issue of Middle East broadly and the issue of democracy and certainly the issue of Israel Palestine play a role where you have candidates who make a point of it, and they actually, it's contested. Some win, some lose, and that's why you can see that in sort of super PACs and campaign contributions, that has become the arena of the fight where millions of dollars spent, particularly on issues that are related to the Middle East, because that's where, if anybody is going to make gains at the expense of the mainstream or the presidential outlook on this, it's going to happen on that stage. And so the money on the Middle East is actually being spent at the primary level. But then, of course, if the president isn't going to have primaries, that's not an issue at all. It might still play out, of course, in congressional politics as we face the primaries, both the Senate and the House. Certainly for the House, we're going to see that again, as we did last time around, with a lot of money being spent on this issue. But for presidential, the president himself isn't going to have primaries. So he's looking to confront Trump. And frankly, most of us who are critical of the way he's handled the Middle East, and certainly the way he's handled the Israeli-Palestinian issue, are not going to abandon him if he's facing Trump or someone like Trump in the elections. He's betting on that. But that's a mistake, I think. The mistake is not that he's wrong, because most people are going to stick with him, but there's something about energizing. There's something about a popularity that when you're measuring popularity now, people are he's going to be unpopular, including among people who are going to vote for him because they like Trump less, or like the Republican candidates less. But he's going to still be unpopular, and that's going to transmit itself. It's going to have implications not just for Democrats, but for non-Democrats, because we report this as he's an unpopular president and so forth. And much of it is coming out of the Democratic constituency. So it matters for him overall, even, of course, if most people who are angry with him on the Middle East are not going to vote for his opponent, they may not be energized. It might affect the public view of him as a leader, as a person, as a consistent man. But it wouldn't affect the actual vote, and it may also not energize people. Maybe the get out of the vote might be impacted. The level of contributions may be impacted. So it will have an impact, but in the end, it isn't a top priority issue for the presidential election. And I think that's why if president doesn't pay as much attention to it as could be the case. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Please, members of the audience, if you have any questions, please start preparing them. Tess?
Good afternoon, everyone. We're edging towards 4. The room has thinned out to the true believers here for democracy and human rights. Hopefully we have a big audience online. I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible in the interest of keeping us all awake and maybe focusing on some questions. But I'm going to take you on a short 3-part journey. The first of which is just doing an assessment, maybe not as detailed as the professors, on the current state of democracy and human rights foreign policy. The second are prospects for any changes to this policy, any recommendations those of us in the democracy and human rights community have for an administration. And then third, any predictions for changes to our foreign policy after 2024. So I'm going to start where we're all familiar about current US policy. I love this phrase because no cool people use it anymore, but the administration came in hot. They came in hot on their democracy and human rights policy for the Middle East, making MBS a pariah, making Egypt a pariah. Actually, I've reviewed some campaign speeches and events recently from before the 2020 elections, and I myself seem to have had a lot of memory loss of what was actually said then. So we found ourselves at the beginning of 2021 with a lot of strong talk, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of expectations about centering democracy and human rights in our relationships internationally, including the Middle East. We had an intelligence report that was released publicly implicating MBS and the highest levels of the Saudi government in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi that resulted in very little additional action that did not result in pariah status whatsoever, that resulted in a fist bump, that resulted in groveling and asking for oil deals, that resulted in nothing. So we find ourselves with not just a reimagined foreign policy, but kind of the same as usual, the same as the last few decades. As several people mentioned earlier, the Biden administration has put the struggle between democracy and autocracy as central to their administration. It's in their national security strategy. It headlines it. It's a core concept. And in that same national security strategy, there's a section on every region in the world. And the Middle East region includes very strident statements that this is not a transformational policy, that this is not looking for big gains, that what we're looking at is stability and security, and to a lesser extent, counterterrorism, which really seems to contradict the opening of the national security strategy and the battle between democracy and autocracy. So again, another example of business as usual. What I like to say is we found ourselves with a pro-democracy and human rights foreign policy that largely exempts the Middle East. And worse than exempting the Middle East, it seems to say that we will tolerate the autocracy and repression and oppression of our allies in the Middle East in order to fight the autocracy from Russia or China, as if it's a trade-off. And I think that we have seen that that's not true. And that allies like Egypt that we are hoping will join with us in standing against Russia were, according to a leak of intelligence from the United States, actually trying to sell weapons to Russia. So this is a lot more complicated than there is a trade-off between really good economic and security deals and really complicated human rights and democracy discussions. That old stale assumption isn't true. We can do all of the above. We can do different elements of all of the above at the same time. So moving on to a sort of a big thing that's been discussed a lot here is sacrificing our values and interests on human rights in sort of a China containment policy, pursuing normalization agreements with Israel that are intended to be transformational with very little evidence or articulation of what is transformational and not incremental. To be clear, countries talking to one another, pursuing peace and stability is important, but the United States providing security guarantees, advanced arms, nuclear energy capabilities to reckless and ruthless dictators that have killed US residents doesn't seem to be a particularly safe choice to make for the United States, with a long goal of containing China, which doesn't seem guaranteed by even that strategy. Other examples we've seen in the news in our own city here today and the last few weeks is the US signing strategic security and economic deals with Bahrain, despite their massive human rights abuses that have been in the news recently. So no one seems to care about reputational risks either. We, of course, talked about the fist bump. We have a security pact with Saudi Arabia, $500 million in arms sales that just went to Saudi Arabia. And of course, the new India, Middle East, Europe trade route agreement that is intended to counter Chinese influence. So that all sounds really depressing. It is very depressing, that assessment of current foreign policy. So I'll move on to my second section, which is what are prospects for changing it and what are recommendations for changing it? You know, luckily, data supports us champions of democracy and human rights. Evidence shows that democracies are reliable, more stable, and more prosperous partners for the United States than autocracies. So why is it that we don't see democracy and human rights as not just a value, but a strategic interest, a vital national security, human security, international peace and security interest for the United States and other countries? This is realpolitik. This is realism. We shouldn't see the argument that it's realpolitik and realism that we can't care about human rights because there are other vital interests. Human rights, pursuit of human rights, respect for democratic principles is in fact what will get us to the stability and prosperity we seek, especially with the climate crisis, the draining of oil, the COVID pandemic, this sort of interrelated international reliance on having to cooperate with one another for global challenges will only be more effective the more democratic and human rights respecting countries become. And it will become less and less effective the more that autocratic, unaccountable, non-transparent, and abusive governments participate in bad faith in this sort of cooperation. So what are we looking at? What should we do? COP28 is coming up in the UAE. Conveniently, 2 years in a row, COP is being held in highly repressive autocratic countries. Perhaps we should take a strategy that climate change progress can only be made with the full, open participation of the people it affects. The climate activists, our own neighbors, people who are seeking fundamental freedoms have been habitually shut out of these discussions. So what progress are we talking about at these events? Second, there is a declaration on principles to combat transnational repression. The United States, for example, has been very focused on transnational repression conducted by China and Russia, largely ignoring the many Middle Eastern allies it has, whether Egypt or Saudi, that are killing people across their borders, oppressing people across their borders, surveilling them, jailing them for tweets that are made when these people have resided in the United States. These, again, are vital national security interests that affect the safety and sovereignty of the people of the United States and the people of countries abroad. So that should be respected. The US administration has an anti-corruption strategy. That anti-corruption strategy was the first major strategy released by this administration, saying that anti-corruption was a national security interest. Where is that in our relationship with our Middle East allies, especially? Where are we centering going after kleptocrats and chasing down money laundering and looking at our allies who may be facilitating oligarchs in Russia and hiding their assets? We also need to support civil society and human rights defenders. A few people have talked about Tunisia. The administration in the last year has reduced the amount of support it has been providing in its economic and security assistance, when we should be making the case for which civil society and human rights activists and civil society groups should in fact be receiving increased support in order to keep democratic space open in an increasingly constricting space. We also should be holding human rights violators accountable. We should be using our sanctions and financial action mechanisms to go after people who seriously abuse human rights or conduct widespread corruption, even if they happen to be our allies in the Middle East. We have talked, I think, across the day about a lot of our military assistance that goes to US allies in the Middle East. This year, the Biden administration held less assistance than ever to the Egyptian government, essentially saying that they had made progress on human rights when, again, data is on our side, indicate that that is not the case. And so I think for a complex foreign policy that pursues a lot of aims, including democracy and human rights, including security, everybody should be able to defend their decisions with data and logic. And I don't see that happening. We also should be, making tools readily available for people across the world to combat internet shutdowns, to combat cyber attacks and spyware. This is a major priority for the Biden administration internationally, and they should make it so in the MENA region as well. So this brings me to the third piece here, which is what are prospects for any of these recommendations being taken on board in 2024 and later? What are the prospects between administrations? I don't think I am going to surprise anybody here by saying that there has been a remarkable consistency in US foreign policy to the Middle East, regardless of administration and regardless of political party. And I do not think that will change in 2024. I think we're going to be seeing any administration prioritizing security assistance and arm deals and energy partnerships. I think we're going to see a continued push on Arab-Israeli normalization. I think we're going to see continued release of foreign military financing to Egypt and other countries, despite continued relentless backsliding on all human rights factors. I think we are witnessing continued rehabilitation of MBS. And I think overall, unless there is a visionary leader or visionary people hired into an administration who see the merits of a more complex relationship to foreign policy in the Middle East, we won't see a lot of changes in 2024.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your comments and your stridency. Unfortunately, like the other two panels earlier today and the whole day, it's a difficult situation. It's a morbid situation, unfortunately, but we have We have some questions from the audience. Please send more if you can, if you like. This question is for Patricia. When supporting democratic opposition forces is going when is supporting democratic opposition forces interference in domestic affairs? What is the best answer to this charge?
When is
When
supporting?
is supporting,
Interference?
opposition, democratic opposition forces considered to be interference in domestic affairs of countries?
Well, to be honest, I think it's always considered to be interference. I mean, the issue here is how much of this interference is desired in some ways. So how much of it is wanted? Now, you know, across the Middle East, there are Democrats and democratic movements, and they have been supported for many years, you know, to different degrees, with the knowledge and sometimes without the knowledge of their governments. And, you know, some of it has been successful and some of it has been less successful.
Well, actually, yeah, the Arab regimes do not like anybody supporting democratic forces in the Arab world. This question is for Kyle. Do you foresee AI-created fraudulent TV spots and phone calls as a factor in the 2024 election?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the sad truths of American life is that we're defined by this dynamic called negative partisanship, which basically means that you kind of like you dislike the other side even more than you like your own side. And what I think that sort of dynamic does when distrust is so high and dislike of the other side is so high that people become very gullible because they're willing to essentially believe a lot of bad things about who they don't like already. And there's a whole lot of content like that out there. And that may also be, you know, either trumped up or even totally fake, as I think we've seen with some, you know, manipulated images or, you know, this so-called deep fakes where you could basically edit a video to make, you know, a political candidate, you know, say basically anything you want them to say. And I do think that, you know, there is still like a robust kind of fact-checking mechanism out there, but at the same time, like there's all sorts of stuff that can spread on the internet that will get a lot of eyeballs that, you know, that people who rely on mainstream news, you know, may not even see. So it is a real problem. I know there's been some discussion about trying to come up with some regulations about AI. I know some of the AI companies have actually come to Washington looking for that kind of regulation, although I'm always wary when there's an industry who's asking to be regulated, because then they're the ones who kind of are the ones who draw up the regulations for themselves. But I do think it's a worrisome problem. And again, it's a I would argue kind of a bad development, and it's also in an environment that is ripe for that sort of basically fake stuff, because again, not only is it the negative partisanship stuff, but also we're just in a time of like very low trust in institutions in the United States. I mean, there are some entities that are still somewhat popular, like, you know, police and fire, our firefighters, and like military is generally still popular, but our, you know, media, presidency, Congress, even the Supreme Court, in particularly lately, they're all viewed pretty negatively. And so and there's just a whole lot of distrust out there. And you also have all of these bad actors and these sophisticated technologies that can put out information that in a low trust environment, people may want to believe, even though it's not true. So, and we have seen, in fact, I think the Republican National Committee ran an ad. I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was images of Biden that were like clearly fake. And, you know, then there's the question of like whether there should be some sort of disclaimer or something. And I also think it was sort of done in such a way that most people probably would recognize that it wasn't real, but you also can't make that assumption. So it's a real challenge. And again, it's the environment we're in plays into why it's such a challenge too.
I want to push you up on this a little bit. Do you think that the regulation of AI is coming?
I don't have a good sense of that. You know, again, there's discussion about it, but I don't know necessarily what it would look like. And so I don't have a good feel for that.
So we're in for a Interesting
One-
period next year.
One other point I would make is that, we do have regulation of like campaign finance and other things in the Federal Election Commission, but the Federal Election Commission is very weak. And sometimes people will basically push the limits, like Ron DeSantis, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm going to bring it back here. So Ron DeSantis has this super PAC that is operating, that is in some ways almost operating as his formal campaign, even though they're not allowed to have any real formal, they're not really, they're really supposed to be separated. But the thing is that the super PAC can sort of push the limits now. And because the FEC is so weak and takes forever to come up with decisions, even if what they're doing is found to be breaking the law or illegal, that may be years down the line before we figure that out. And the penalties may be basically very, very minor. So, it's not just will there be regulations, it's like, what's the enforcement mechanism for them? And what are the penalties for breaking it? And sometimes the penalties will be enforced far into the future and will be fairly minor. So that to me is kind of a problem too, because again, the FEC is very weak.
Right, yeah. Thank you. This question is for Shibley. Is the Biden push for Israeli-Saudi normalization designed to show a so-called win to the American public of a Biden foreign policy success?
Sorry, I don't know if this was aimed at me, but I was disconnected and I had to sign on.
If you like me, I can read it again to you.
Yeah, please do, because I just had to sign back on.
Is the Biden push for Israeli-Saudi normalization designed to show a so-called win to the American public of a Biden foreign policy success?
I do not believe that it's going to be helpful to him politically. I actually think it's going to hurt him politically. Win or lose, it's going to hurt him politically. Let me tell you why. First of all, the public is not, the Democratic constituency is not particularly happy with either this Israeli government or the Saudi government. We see that. And we have seen in prior polls that I have conducted that they were not happy with Trump spending time on this issue. But neither the Israeli government nor the Saudi government are desperate to have that agreement. Perhaps the Israeli government a little bit more, because it'll help them obviously with their own domestic constituency if they were to get such a huge strategic benefit from the relationship with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis don't really need this agreement so much now. And frankly, both the Israelis and the Saudis ultimately would prefer to have Donald Trump win based on previous interactions in the election. So they're not particularly anxious to reward Biden to help them electorally. And in the end, in fact, it could fail. They don't have much to lose if it fails. Biden has a little bit more to lose if he fails. I also think that if there is, in fact, an agreement, the United States is going to have to obviously provide the Saudis with two things that the Saudis want, which is enrichment of uranium and a nuclear program, and where the public, the American public, may be somewhat reluctant on that, although I don't think that's the biggest obstacle, or security guarantees for the Saudis, which obviously would obligate the United States in case of war, particularly war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I'm not sure that the public thinks that there's enough benefit that would accrue to the United States from an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel that would get enough support even among Democrats and certainly among Republicans for this issue. That's a debatable issue. We don't know this obviously for sure, but I think that's going to be contested. I don't think it's going to be very clear whether even the Congress would support such an agreement. So in the end, I don't really see that he would reap a benefit. Obviously, it's going to be sold as coming at the expense of China's influence in the Middle East, meaning that this somehow the U.S. will get from Saudi Arabia, some commitment on reducing Chinese influence in the Middle East. I think it's too complicated, frankly, for the American public to to see that as a direct benefit to the U.S., even though they obviously worry about China, it is an issue for them. It might work more with members of Congress as a rationalization argument. Those members who might want to support it for political reasons or other reasons might be able to hide behind that argument, but I don't think it's going to help the president electorally. In any case, I think foreign policy in the end isn't going to be the big win or lose in this election. We all know that. So I think it's wasting a lot of energy. I'm not going to say that it's going to hurt the president much. I don't think it's going to help them much. I think it's going to be certainly it isn't going to be a factor that's decisive in winning or losing the election vis-a-vis the Republican candidate.
Shibley, I'd like to go a little bit further with this. There is speculation that maybe, just maybe, President Biden has this great idea of pushing for this normalization because that will end in the collapse of the Israeli government. Because the Israelis would be disoriented, would reject the deal. Something would happen with the governing coalition. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, the reality of it is that this Israeli government, given who the members, particularly the far right members, but even Netanyahu himself, there is no way that they will make any changes in the posture of Israel on the Palestinian issue that would be meaningful. There may be cosmetic decisions, but decisions such as ending all settlements, decisions such as turning Area C to the Palestinian Authority, even those are limited in commitment to real sovereign Palestinian state on 67 with East Jerusalem as its capital, as the official Saudi position. Nothing approaching any of that is acceptable to the far right members and even the right members, I would say, Likud members of the Israeli government. So I think that I'm not expecting any major breakthrough in Israel, Palestine, regardless, but maybe some people at least sold it to the president. Certainly people who are frustrated with the right wing, who think that somehow if you have a more centrist coalition with the Likud, certainly like the one we've had in the past, they will somehow be remove some of the pressure, the immediate pressure from the U.S. to act, particularly given what these far right, they've been very upfront about their racism, very upfront about their wanting to control all of the West Bank. There's no room for the U.S. to pretend like that isn't the case. Sure, I think maybe the president was persuaded by some that this effort might actually lead perhaps to the collapse of the current government and perhaps to a different kind of coalition that would emerge in Israel, maybe with Gantz instead of with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. I happen to think, of course, that's not going to solve the immediate problem, and the occupation has been there for 56 years with no end in sight long before the rise of the far-right government. But nonetheless, that far-right government has put American foreign policy in a very difficult place. You can't pretend anymore like two states is around the corner. You can't pretend anymore that what you have is not deeply unjust and unacceptable. And so, I think they could have been persuaded of that. There's reason to think the president may, some of the remarks he's made, to the extent that he, for example, reads the column by Tom Friedman in the New York Times. I know he does. This is important to him. In fact, I think in some ways one can argue that some people who maybe even in the White House or elsewhere who might want the president to be persuaded that are happy often when Tom Friedman writes something along these lines. Sure, it could have been. It could be part of the way he's part of a package of issues that played into his decision to make this a priority.
Thank you. Thanks. This question is for Tess. several of the MENA countries are basically hybrid regimes. Turkey, Morocco, I can't make the third one, which allow for opposition in some countries to, to be part of government. Can the United States help such opposition group, and how?
So it's the position of the United States government to politically not advantage one group over the other, which I think is both a moral and strategic good. I will say this is similar to a question that Patricia got earlier, which is democracy support is important. And I will boldly state, it's not interference, and some of the worst autocrats on earth make that conflation. For example, the Russias and the Chinas of the world claim that the democracy support, the NGOs, the international advocacy groups who help those in other countries, whether it's political parties or nonprofits or civil society, to grow their own democracies is somehow the same as Russian election interference or Chinese transnational repression. And so I just want to make it very clear that those are not the same thing, and that foreign assistance and support for pro-democracy actors in other countries is absolutely something that the US government and its allies should support. I also want to make a point that there is a lot of talk by hybrid regimes as well as authoritarian regimes who like to make the point often that their countries are not quite ready for democracy. Their countries don't really have the quality or the culture to support democracy. I find that to be really a damaging form of co-opting Orientalist language that the United States and other countries have used for decades to oppress people around the world. I find that really damaging. I don't think the United States or its allies should buy into that argument. I don't think they should enable that argument. I think they absolutely should support, just like they do in Belarus and just like they do in Kenya and in countries around the world, whether they're allies, hybrid regimes, authoritarian regimes, pro-democracy forces, to thrive, even if it's not seeking transformational change, for incremental change, to increasing the respect for and the space for fundamental freedoms and human rights in each country, I think is a core aspect of dignity that every human on earth deserves, and that the United States government, yes, can certainly has and should increasingly support.
Thank you very much. Now, this question is for, I guess, for everybody, and everyone can answer at least part of it. Given that we can establish that the U.S. prioritizes stability and interests over democracy, what alternative approaches can we propose to challenge this and amplify the voices of the grassroots? Patricia.
I can try to answer it by saying that this emphasis on stability has really led to a sort of, been concomitant with a kind of power vacuum. And the power vacuum, as I mentioned, is being filled by, autocratic actors to the detriment of the US. And now this push for stability, which also involves, subcontracting, if you will, of the region's affairs to either the states themselves or their patron, is actually contributing to the region going in a negative direction. So I think this will actually push the US to become more involved naturally, because it's going to lead to an imbalance and lead to the rise of illiberalism, for lack of a better word. So I think the US, as much as it wants, if it wants to desist itself from the region, will be pulled back into the region eventually if things go the way that they're going.
Good.
I mean, I obviously agree with Patricia that it's just a fallacious trade-off between democracy and human rights and stability. It's very clear that oppressive regimes eventually become unstable. One of my favorite phrases, so I hope you'll use it, at home all the time with your kids, with your family, is internal repression begets external aggression. There's nothing stable about a country unable to govern itself without muzzling most of its population, having an iron grip on people, mass imprisonment of political prisoners and others. There's nothing stable about that. And eventually the deck of cards will fall. So I think to that end, and getting it similar to the last question, is that simply supporting, elevating, like publicly engaging with human rights defenders and civil society in other countries is something that the United States and other governments can do that is actually meaningful. It tells people that they're not unseen, that they're not actually silent, that all the methods their governments take to silence and oppress them and harm them and imprison them does not escape the eyes of the world. I will also say other tools, like I mentioned before, whether it's sanctions or other financial actions, are strategic decisions the United States can make to hold bad actors accountable, to hold specific individuals or banks or companies accountable who create these massive human rights violations.
If I may add, I think, obviously, the United States is not going to be able to transform every country and doesn't have the bandwidth or the know-how how to transform every country. And we've seen it. And when, the U.S. said it was trying to spread democracy, obviously it wasn't in fact happening. And the public in the Middle East, particularly after the Iraq War, devastating war, was obviously the public in the Arab world, according to all public opinion polls, never believed at all that the U.S. was trying to spread democracy. I think there are two things to keep in mind here. Number one is the power of the United States has to first and foremost be about the power of example. And right now, whatever American foreign policy is, we don't have the power of example. We are in trouble, or democracy is in trouble. In fact, according to my public opinion polls in the U.S., the majority of American people don't think we are a good model for the rest of the world. And prior to the Russian invasion of Kuwait, a large poll of multiple countries around the world found that the majority of people thought the U.S. was more a hindrance to democracy than an asset for democracy. So the model has to start at home, and I think that is something that we have to learn. We have to get our house in order first and foremost. The second thing is that while we cannot transform countries, we don't have the capacity to do it. We don't have the know-how to do it. People in the region, governments, political forces, they're in it for 24 hours a day, every day of the week, in order to get their own interest and power in place. And for the U.S., this is always, what happens in Morocco, what happens in Algeria, what happens in Tunisia is always going to be something of secondary nature. I think we have to be consistent and focused principally about major violations of human rights. And while there was a question early whether, do we have the right to do that interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries? No, it's not always, because we do have international conventions about rights of citizens, about rights of all people, about discrimination, about apartheid, about major violations of human rights. But we have to work with international institutions. We cannot do this unilaterally. And that's why I think it's very important to build at least a coalition of like-minded people. There was something to be said for Biden's focus on a liberal international order following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if in fact we're implemented accordingly, where in fact then you're consistently pushing for the same international rules and norms that should apply everywhere, in every region, toward every country. And then you can have a lot of like-minded people, in this particular case, maybe Western countries and a few others, who would push for it, or forces within other countries that would push for it. We obviously have not been doing that. And I think that is one of the failures, in my opinion, of this administration, after starting on a very strong footing with the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you. Guy, want to say anything here?
I would just say, I do think that the United States has fallen into this period where it's kind of inward. It feels like the public is kind of more inward looking than maybe they were previously, although, maybe I don't know, the Cold War era, maybe some of what we think about in terms of a forward or an outward looking country, maybe some of that is, mythologizing, but, some of where I think particularly where the Republicans are on foreign policy is, Donald Trump, brought back the term America First. I mean, that was something that was sort of part of the kind of conservative foreign policy before World War II, in this very kind of inward-looking time, particularly after American involvement in World War I. But I agree with the other panelists in that part of what's important for the United States is just to present sort of a positive image of our own democracy at home. And, there are obviously lots of challenges with that. When I was watching, like following along on January 6th, 2021, one of the things that just popped through my head was like, what sort of example is this for the rest of the world? Not just in, I mean, you could look at it in both sort of a way of like this sort of horrible display of sort of divisiveness that we're presenting to the world, but also I just took it as a tremendous sign of weakness internally that something like that could happen at your capital and what that might mean for the future. And so I thought it was a bleak moment, both for America's sort of soft power projection, but also for our hard power projection, in that it made us look weak in two different kinds of ways. And, I don't know, I think there probably are longer lasting repercussions of that we haven't quite figured out yet, but certainly a negative moment.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just, exploit your experience here and expertise on the electoral college. What's the talk about the electoral college today? Not 50 years ago.
Public opinion about it is pretty polarized on partisan lines, which you might expect. The Republicans have benefited from it in recent years. And so, there's also if you were to try to change the electoral college, the way it works is you need a 2/3 vote in both chambers of the House in the House and the Senate,
Yeah.
and also 3/4 of the states would have to agree to it. And there are enough smaller states who probably feel like they'd be disadvantaged by a change in the electoral college. They won't want to do it. Plus, I can't imagine, again, if you're if Texas becomes a blue state in 20 years, which I think is possible, maybe the Republicans will want to get rid of the electoral college, because at that point, Texas basically equals all the swing states in the Midwest put together. So if that becomes a Democratic state, it's gonna be really hard for the Republicans to win, assuming there aren't any other big changes across the country. Usually there are big changes. And so maybe we would continue to be in this sort of competitive era. But there's an effort that's been going on for years called the National Popular Vote Compact. And what that would do was it has a certain, states can sign on and say, once 270 electoral votes worth of states, the winning number, sign on to this compact, we all agree to award our electoral votes to the National Popular Vote winner. So it would be this sort of like jury rigged way around the electoral college. And I think it's up to 205 electoral votes worth of states have signed up for it. Michigan, which has a Democratic controlled government now, is considering doing it. But so, 205, it's getting there, but it's not quite close to 270. And basically all the states that have signed up for it are blue states. So once you start getting into the more competitive states, it's going to be harder to get people to sign on to it. Also, I'm sort of skeptical as to whether, if you had the requisite number of electoral votes as part of the compact, I'm skeptical as to whether it would actually work and whether it would survive legal scrutiny. And also you might have states that are blue states now that sign on to it, but then by the time the rubber meets the road and you have an election where you'd actually have to activate it, maybe that state, voted a different way for president and their state government would go along with that. And so you could have some sort of crisis. But it speaks to just the real difficulty of these ancient institutions, this real difficulty in actually doing anything about them. Of course, because we have this very strong constitution and this design in which it's very difficult to change it. And there are pluses and minuses of it, but I think you see the minuses in our electoral system, just in that, I love the electoral college because I'm an elections analyst. And so it's like more expertise for me to be like, oh, well, this state votes that way and this state votes that way. But is it good for the country? No, I wouldn't argue that. Right. But it's even in this sort of end run around it, which is sort of the most practical way, it would still be very difficult to do, I think.
Thank you. Tess, we have a question on U.S. foreign policy toward Morocco under Biden. Biden did not rescind the recognition of Western Sahara as Moroccan territory, and there are some really close relations between the United States and Morocco. What do you think about that?
I mean, I unfortunately don't think I can add much more than you, which is that Morocco is a strategic security partner of the United States. So, I mean, regardless of other decisions the US makes in foreign policy, I don't think we're going to see any massive swift changes in the US policy towards Morocco or any sort of substantial support for the defense of democracy or human rights or civil society. I would love to see it. And I think because it is such a strategic partner for the United States, and like an earlier commenter said, you know, a hybrid regime, sort of a struggling democracy, I would like to see some progress there. And I think because it is such a strategic partner, is the United States probably has more leverage in Morocco than in other countries in the region.
That's right, yeah. Patricia, I have a question for you on Biden and MBS. You know, he wanted to teach him a lesson, stuff like that. What is that lesson?
Biden wanted to teach him?
Yeah, I mean, you know, he wanted to teach Saudi Arabia a lesson. He wanted to
Well,
really,
Tess said it well, because what did you say? What was the expression that you used?
He wanted to make him a pariah, but
No,
it never
no,
happened.
How democracy promotion under Biden went strong, started strong and
Started
then sort
strong.
of fizzled and then focused on the
Right.
on a much more was very much pragmatic.
so,
We
okay,
have seen now, I mean, as Tess mentioned, to some extent, an attempt even to rehabilitate the image of MBS. I mean, both on the MBS side and on the US administration
Right.
side, sadly. And perhaps, I mean, perhaps this is tied to the realization that, you know, the US was beginning to, and perhaps is continuing to losing some of these strategic allies, you know, when they were failing to, you know, to be there for them, like with the Aramco, with the US's reaction to the Aramco, to the attack on Aramco, which really led the US to be sort of recalibrating its approach, Saudi Arabia to be recalibrating its approach and deciding to take matters in its own hands,
yeah,
hence the Iran-Saudi deal, et cetera. So I don't see that lesson was very well taught.
My question was centered on, is Biden more interested now in MBS's survival or what? What do you think?
His survival, I don't think it's part of the calculations. I think it's much more interest-based in the sense that perhaps the US is realizing that, again, in this sense, its allies, its traditional allies, from a pragmatic point of view, are sort of looking elsewhere.
Right.
You know, are shopping around for patrons, given that, you know, they haven't come through for them. And I think the pragmatism is taking over the idealism. I'm not saying it should be the case, but I think that's what has happened.
Okay, I have a question. I postponed it till towards the end because I was reluctant to ask it, but I'm going to ask it. Somebody asked it of Kyle and of Shibley on the Senator Menendez affair. How is that going to affect anything that has to do with the United States and Egypt?
Well, I can handle the political repercussions anyway. You know, so we're in an era in American politics where I think shamelessness is pretty prevalent. I mean, Trump is like the best example of that, but there are other examples of others. George Santos, the congressman from New York, who basically made up his whole life story and probably going to be convicted of crimes at some point. But he, you know, this stuff was all revealed after he got elected, sort of surprisingly. And, you know, there was pushes for him to resign. And of course, he didn't do it. Governor Ralph Northam, a Democrat from Virginia, not the governor anymore, he used to be, but some yearbook photos came out of him likely dressed in a Ku Klux Klan outfit from when he was in college. There was all this outrage about it in 2019, lots of calls for him to resign. I think in a different era, maybe he would have resigned. He decided to stick it out. And so with Menendez, we saw there was floodgates open today in which many US senators called on him to resign. A lot of the New Jersey political establishment on the Democratic side has called for him to resign. But it doesn't seem like he's actually going to do so. in part because of this shamelessness I'm talking about, but also frankly that, he may be able to trade his job for leniency in a plea deal later on if he stays in office. There's also always the possibility that he could just run again and still win, although he has drawn at least one, I think, very strong challenger in Andy Kim, Democratic House member from New Jersey. But again, I think it's emblematic of this broader kind of problem that things that may have prompted people to resign in the past maybe don't prompt them to resign now.
Shibley?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the accusations are so serious that, they're absolutely troubling and shocking in many ways. So we don't, obviously, you've got to wait to see what, whether, there is a truth to all of what has come out. And will wait to see what happens with the Egyptian angle of this in terms of the role played in influencing the center one way or the other, particularly on other issues. That's not clear at this point. I think it'll become clear. It could be hurtful if there's details we don't know that come out. I actually think that in the short term, his trouble, particularly if he in fact does resign or forced to resign, is going to be more on the vote on the Saudi-U.S. deal if such a deal in fact is put on the table, because everyone knows that Menendez have been very, very supportive of Israel on this issue, and I think people are counting on as being, sort of a very big advocate of any deal that would come out between Israel and Saudi Arabia, even if it had a component that obligates the United States in terms of defense of Saudi Arabia. In the past, he has played a very critical role as the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think he is weakening, even if he stays, and his departure, given the reluctance that I know exists in Congress about this issue, could actually undermine the prospects of support among Democrats for a deal. May not be the critical factor, but I think it's certainly a detrimental factor.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, there are a few other questions we're not going to be able to get to, but because I want to give the panel an opportunity to a 1 minute final word, so to speak, starting with you, Patricia.
I guess in thinking through when I talked about or when I responded to the question about democracy promotion being, I think the word was interference, I meant it in the way that China support isn't. And, that democracy promotion is about making conditions or conditioning aid. It's about building capacity, and it's about giving financial support. But ultimately, it's really about leveling the playing field. And depending on the context that we're operating in, whether it's permissive or not, it differs depending on the context. Now, as democracy declines in the region, which is happening, and really human rights abuses are on the rise, whether in the form of, crackdowns in authoritarian countries, or transnational repression, or digital authoritarianism. What is really happening is we have pressure cooker situations, and there are these contests of wills that exist, and unrests, I think, wanes and wax. And I think in that context, really, the US, I want to reinforce the point that the US really needs to be more engaged in supporting local efforts to promote or to fight for these rights and freedoms, especially in the context of kind of a declining democracy, because I think these efforts are the ones that will inevitably shape the future of the region.
Thank you very much.
Just one other thing about 2024, and I didn't specifically mention this earlier, but I meant to. So one of the things that was sort of odd about the 2022 midterm was that you can ask the approval of the president on like a spectrum, both approve and disapprove, but also strong approve, somewhat approve, somewhat disapprove, and strong disapprove. And of course, the strong disapprovers, they're pretty heavily Republican. They voted very Republican in that last election. Strong approvers, vote Democratic very consistently. But Democrats, there's a block of voters. It's like 10 to 15% of people who describe themselves as just somewhat disapproving of the president. And Democrats, according to exit polls, actually won slightly that group of voters. And so when I talk about like cross-pressured people, it's not just the people who maybe have negative views of both Biden and Trump, but also who disapprove of Biden, but don't disapprove of him strongly. And that's another just group of people that really we need to be watching for the, for this presidential election coming up next year.
Thanks. Shibley?
Well, obviously, the United States has every right to condition aid and its relationship to steps that would be taken that are in harmony with its values. But we have to be clear that that isn't necessarily something that people are going to buy. In part because when there is mistrust of American intentions, when there is suspicion about the nature of American aims, when there is uncertainty about the nature of the American political system, the way this is going to be seen by those who may be targeted, as recipients of aid or being helped, may not be what we intend, particularly given the variations that we have in government, whether you're Trump or Biden or Bush, conducting foreign policy. That's why I always say that the best way to serve and help internationally is to do it in harmony with other state. Unilateralism, even in the advocacy of democracy, is not sustainable because you can see it that way. You may define it in one way and may not be accurate, but that's not the way it's going to be received. And that's not the way it's going to function in the countries that you intended to function. It has to be in harmony with international law and norms. You have to have a coalition. And that is why it has to be an international effort, not just a unilateral effort, even on such an important issue as a core value that could be a core value of the United States, such as democracy.
Thank you. Tess?
So I feel like at the end of this day, it can be described as kind of a big bummer. We've talked a lot of dynamics that are depressing. We've talked about how there doesn't seem to be change in the regional space, the national space, the foreign policy space. So I wanted to end with something inspirational, let's say, or call to action, which is democracy and human rights matter. And it doesn't matter whatever else we're talking about, security, economics, international peace and security, democracy and human rights matter. They matter to making progress on climate action. They matter for high standard international development, infrastructure development. Democracy and human rights matters for our own peace and stability. Democracy and human rights matters for the international and multilateral rules-based system. It matters. And so we don't have to be looking at transformational change in order to remind ourselves that democracy and human rights matters. We can care about incremental change. We can care about challenging assumptions in our communities or with our friends or in foreign policy. And we can have confidence that democracy is the best system to protect the human rights of everyone on the planet, while also having the humility to know that we don't always get it right and that we can never do it alone.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for the panel for ending on a very, very nice note. Thank you very much for attending our panel. Thank you for attending the whole day. We appreciate your being here. And we hope that you follow our work and continue to look us up and participate in our events. We appreciate it very, very much.